So, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would your spell rank in terms of overall power, would you say? Today, we're going to talk about the basic rules covering spellcasting in Pathfinder 2nd Edition on today's episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I'm the local disaster tour guide. That's right, I am a storyteller so verbose and pedantic that it's honestly a little off-brand that it's taken so long for me to do a fake college lecture as the thematic gag of a video. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder, and welcome to my Spellcasting in Pathfinder 2e series, where I talk about the rules that cover spellcasting and what you need to know to effectively play a spellcaster in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Today is the first video in the series that I'm calling Spellcasting 101, the Basics of Spellcasting. Over the years, I've had the opportunity to play a wide variety of different TTRPGs, and personally, I really love playing spellcasting characters. Wizard is my all-time favorite character archetype, and in any system that's kind of the character I tend to gravitate towards. And while the Wizard class in specific is not necessarily my favorite in Pathfinder 2e, I do still really love spellcasting in this system, and contrary to some of the online discussions I've seen around spellcasting, I actually like a lot about what Paizo did with the spellcasting rules in this game. However, by the same token, over the years playing a wide variety of TTRPGs, I have heard a very consistent phrase used by a lot of different players, which is, spellcasting makes my head hurt. Seriously, I've heard that exact phrase several times, and it kind of breaks my heart a little bit that there are a lot of people out there who avoid spellcasting classes because the complexity of spellcasting puts them off from actually trying to play that style of character. So my hope in doing this series is to provide a framework for how spellcasting works in Pathfinder 2e, so that if you're interested in playing a spellcaster, you have the frame of reference to understand the rules and be effective in playing the character. All in all, I think that Pathfinder 2nd Edition has a really good approach to spellcasting, and once you get past a few sticking points, it's actually a very approachable and usable system that can lead to some very fun and engaging characters. To give you an example, my wife has been playing TTRPGs for many years, but for a very long time, she didn't like playing spellcasters. She tried them in systems like D&D 3.0 or Pathfinder 1st Edition, and while there were some elements of spellcasters that she found appealing, she also frequently left frustrated with those characters. However, when Pathfinder 2nd Edition first dropped, I remember a very early conversation where I was talking about some of the changes to Pathfinder 2e's spellcasting, and suddenly my wife was invested in the system. Someone who normally avoided spellcasters suddenly fell in love with spellcasters, and she's played several of them in 2e since then, because Paizo has approached spellcasting really well. So my hope for this video, my hope for this series, is that I can help clarify what the spellcasting rules are, so that if you're a little bit nervous about trying out a spellcaster, that you have the tools and knowledge necessary to approach what is a very solidly designed portion of this game. Now, obviously spellcasting can be a huge subject, as evidenced by the incredible number of spells that are available. So naturally, I'm not going to be able to cover every single thing you could ever possibly want to know about spellcasting all in one video. That's too long-winded even by my standards. I know, shocking, isn't it? So for today's video, what I'm going to be doing is focusing in on the spellcasting rules that are found in the Spells chapter of the Player Core Rulebook for the Pathfinder 2e Remaster. In particular, we're going to be looking at pages 297 to 303. These 7 pages, which are honestly a pretty quick read, cover the vast majority of information that you will ever need to know to approach and understand the majority of spellcasting in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. In fact, the first and easiest piece of advice I can give you is, if you're going to play a spellcaster, open up Player Core 1, pull up that chapter, and take the time to read those 7 pages. If you do that, you're going to have a fantastic head start on effectively playing a spellcaster. So in today's video, what I'm going to do is dive into those pages, take a look at the majority of the spellcasting rules in those pages. There are a few things that I will be saving for a later video. And by doing that, I will be giving you a very solid frame of reference for understanding any spell that you read, any spellcasting class that you pick up. Understanding these basic rules will make any spellcasting class in the game approachable. Now, one thing I will be doing in this video and throughout this series is I will also be pointing out other references that you can use if you want to dig a little bit deeper into specific topics or into specific pieces of inspiration that Paizo has given us. The pages in Player Core 1 that we're covering today give you the framework for understanding magic, and they are a very important resource for anyone who wants to play a spellcaster. However, if you want to go beyond just the technical or mechanical aspects of what spellcasting is, another good resource is the pre-remaster Pathfinder 2e book, Secrets of Magic. In particular, pages 7 through 27 of that book go into a lot of the flavor and inspiration for magic in the game Pathfinder 2e, and if you want to understand what magic looks like and feels like inside the world of Golarion, that is a fantastic flavor reference that you can use to get inspiration for your characters. Now, I will warn you, Secrets of Magic is a pre-remaster book, meaning that it uses some old terminology and some old rules in its discussion of what magic is and how magic functions. So if you're just coming to Pathfinder 2nd Edition since the remaster has occurred, be aware that some of the information in Secrets of Magic is a bit dated, but from a flavor perspective, from a painting a picture of the world your character is in, Secrets of Magic is excellently written, and that can be a fantastic flavor dive for anyone who is interested in trying out a spellcasting class. Still, today what we're going to be focusing on is those pages in the Player Core, because that is the mechanical foundation of spellcasting, and hopefully by the end of this video, you will have the basics of spellcasting down, and you will be ready to try out a spellcasting character. Of course, before we get into all of that, don't forget to do all of the things that help to support this channel. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. You can check out my free Discord and my Patreon. All of the links will be down in the video description, along with a link to some of the spellcasting rules that can be found on Archives of Nethys, in case you'd like to read some of this for yourself. Still, with all that out of the way, let's get started. Alright, let's start with a basic question that many people probably don't even think to ask. What is spellcasting, and what does it mean to be a spellcaster? Well, Pathfinder 2nd Edition has a very clear, very distinct answer to those questions. Spellcasting is defined as the ability to use spell slots. We'll get into what those are in a moment. And a spellcaster is someone who has access to and who can use those spell slots. There you go, that's the definition. Spellcasting is the use of spell slots. Now, what's a spell slot? Thinking broadly and conceptually, magic as a force is something that permeates the whole of the Golarion campaign setting, regions like the Mana Waste notwithstanding. Magic is a force that can appear anywhere and that can do many different things, and magic in and of itself is just sort of this force that is fundamental to a fantasy setting. However, when it comes to spellcasting, this broad and nebulous force needs to be contained, it needs to be controlled and directed, And that is what a spell slot represents. A spell slot is a distinct package of magical potential that a spellcaster has the ability to grasp and manipulate and use in whatever way they see fit. Once you conceptualize a spell slot as that distinct package of magical potential, then the next thing you can do is you can conceptualize larger and larger packets of potential, and this is where the idea of spell ranks comes into play. Essentially, spell slots are divided into 10 different ranks, starting at first rank, then going to second rank, third rank, fourth rank, all the way up to 10th rank spells, with each step up in spell rank representing a conceptual increase in the amount of power and potential that that particular spell slot holds. Ergo, if you have a spellcaster who commands first rank spells, they command the basic and introductory spells that early students of magical power might seek to manipulate, but as they step up to second rank, third rank, and fourth rank, the spellcaster is progressing in the amount of magic that they can contain, control, and direct for their own use. That means that if you're playing a spellcasting class, one of the core features of your class is going to be your spell slots. At first level, you will get some first rank spell slots that you can put first rank spells into, and when you use those spell slots, you get whatever magical effect you had inserted into that spell slot. By the way, a quick note on nomenclature. Something that you may see in online discussions is the term Vancian casting. The spell slot-based progression that Pathfinder 2e uses for its spellcasting classes, that is a reflection of a design approach to spellcasting that is often called Vancian casting in the larger TTRPG community. Pathfinder is not the only game that uses spell slots, there are many other games that do that, and the term Vancian casting is often used to describe this style of magic being used mechanically in a game. However, I don't think I've seen Paizo use the phrase Vancian casting anywhere in their published books to describe the spell slot-based approach. So, since Paizo does not use the term Vancian casting in its products, I'm not going to be using the term Vancian casting in these videos. I'm going to try to stick to the terminology that Paizo actually uses. But if you're looking at online discussions and you see Vancian casting pop up somewhere, that's just a common and collective term for the spell slot-based progression that games like Pathfinder 2e use, so if you see that term, don't let it confuse you. The overall number and rank of the spell slots you can access is going to be based on your class, and it will progress at a very predictable rate over the course of your character progression. Now, most of your spellcasting classes are going to start with those first rank spells, and they will progress slowly up to 10th rank spells by the end of their career. There are two classes that are a little bit unique in how their spell slots work. That is the Magus and the Summoner. I'm not going to be going too in-depth into them in this video, but I am hoping to talk about some of the differences in how they access spell slots in a future video. I've seen a lot of people in the Pathfinder 2e community refer to their style of spellcasting as wave spellcasting. For now, the main thing you need to know is they do still use spell slots, even if their spell slot progression is a little bit atypical compared to classes like the Wizard, the Cleric, the Druid, or other normal spellcasters in the game. Now, with all that in mind, there is one piece of commentary I want to give you about spell slots in Pathfinder 2e that I think is worth noting, especially if you're coming from other TTRPGs, and that is, spell slots are a very precious resource. I know that that statement should seem self-explanatory, but let me dig a little bit deeper. Because spell slots are such a core mechanic to what spellcasting is, Paizo made the decision in how they designed Pathfinder 2e to, for lack of a better way of saying this, make spell slots kinda rare. In other TTRPGs, even TTRPGs that use a spell slot system, there is often some kind of universal mechanic available that allows you to get bonus spell slots, and as you level up, you can usually accumulate a lot of bonus spell slots, giving you access to additional magical abilities that you can use. In Pathfinder 2e, there are some instances where you can get bonus spell slots, but they are much, much rarer in this game than they are in other TTRPGs. That core magical progression of your class really is the core of your class, and if you're approaching a Pathfinder 2e spellcaster coming from another system, one thing you want to be aware of is you're not going to get a lot of bonus spell slots. Don't expect to. If and when a bonus spell slot does show up in Pathfinder 2e, the thing you need to know is it's probably going to come with a lot of restrictions. Yes, you can get a bonus spell slot here or there, but that bonus spell slot is going to be very narrowly defined in terms of what you can do with it. The classic example of this in Pathfinder 2e would be the Wizard's Arcane School, which gives them additional spell slots at every spell rank they can access, but those bonus spell slots can only be filled with spells from the Wizard's Arcane School. The normally broad and versatile spell list that the wizard has access to cannot be used with those spell slots. There's a very narrow list of options that are available. As a result, if you're playing a spellcaster, know that those spell slots, they're the core of what you do. They are a very valuable resource, and using them wisely, well, and in a timely fashion is going to be what is necessary to get the most out of your character. Okay, so now that we've established that the baseline of what a spellcaster is the use and manipulation of spell slots, let's dive into how spellcasters actually use those spell slots. One of the big divisions in Pathfinder 2nd Edition is between prepared and spontaneous spellcasters. In the player core for the Pathfinder 2e remaster, the cleric, the druid, the witch, and the wizard are all prepared spellcasters, and the bard is a spontaneous spellcaster. In the upcoming book, Player Core 2, we're going to get some new spellcasting classes, and classes like the Sorcerer and the Oracle are going to fall under the spontaneous spellcaster label, just like the bard in Player Core 1. Every spellcasting class in Pathfinder 2e is going to fit into one of these two categories. At least until the Animist class releases, and then I'm going to have to do an entire extra video, thank you Paizo. So, since both of these terms are very common, it's worth understanding what these terms mean, so when you are considering a spellcasting class, you know how that's going to influence your play. I like to think of prepared and spontaneous spellcasting as a question of where the spellcaster can choose to be flexible. Do they want to be flexible in how they access their spells, or do they want to be flexible in how they apply their spell slots? Prepared spellcasters often have a great deal of versatility in the spells that they can access and potentially bring to bear during the course of an adventuring day. However, once a prepared spellcaster has selected their spells, they are kind of locked in on those choices. On the flip side, you have spontaneous casters who don't have nearly as broad of an access to what spells they can potentially use. Their overall spell selection is very much locked in, but the spontaneous caster makes up for that with flexibility in how they actually use their spell slots. Let's get a little more specific. A prepared spellcaster, like the wizard, every day at the start of the day, they are going to prepare their spells. They have a certain number of spell slots available to them, and they're going to look at whatever spells they can access and decide which spells they want to put in which spell slot. Maybe they put a Force Barrage in one of their first rank spell slots, and maybe they put the classic Fireball in one of their third rank spell slots. For each of their spell slots, they're going to take some time and decide exactly which spell they want. Now, what should be very clear is, this leads to a lot of flexibility in terms of what spells a prepared spellcaster actually gets to use. If I know that I'm going to be dealing with fire elementals on the next adventure, I'm probably not going to put a Fireball into one of my third rank spell slots. That would be a wasted spell. I can put something much more useful, much more applicable to the upcoming challenge, and then I have access to it. As long as I can access a spell, I can put whatever I want into that spell slot, and I have a great deal of freedom in what I get to pick. However, once I put the specific spell into that spell slot, it's locked in. That's the downside of the prepared spellcaster. The idea that prior planning is critical to effective spellcaster play really shines through for the prepared spellcaster, because once you put that spell in that spell slot, you either use it or you lose it. You can't use that spell slot for anything else. Another notable challenge of the prepared spellcaster is the fact that since you have to assign a specific spell to a specific spell slot, you only have a number of uses of a specific spell that corresponds to how many times you programmed that spell in. Fireball may prove to be an incredibly useful spell, but if I only prepared it in one spell slot at the start of the day, then I only have one use of Fireball. I don't get to use it over and over again. So if my wizard throws out a Fireball early and then later in the day I encounter a situation where that Fireball would have been much more useful, I'm just out of luck. Now, prepared spellcasters can get around this a little bit in that you do have the option of preparing a spell multiple times. Let's say I have 3 third-rank spell slots. Well, if I wanted to, I could put Fireball in one of those spell slots, 2 of them, or even potentially all 3, and then I potentially have up to 3 uses of Fireball during the course of my adventuring day. However, those spell slots are locked in, and if I don't need 3 uses of Fireball, well, I don't get to use those spell slots for anything else. Now, I will say on the subject of prepared spellcasters and access, you are going to want to read up the specifics on your class, because every class is going to access spells a little bit differently. Wizards, for example, are well known for having a spell book, and what that means is they have a book that they have written spells into, and they can prepare any spell in their spell book in one of their spell slots. However, if they haven't discovered a spell, if they haven't written it down, they don't have access to it, but throughout the course of adventuring, they might copy a new spell from a scroll, or they might use some downtime to learn some new spells. Some classes, like the Wizard, are going to have access to spells based on what is stored in a particular location or particular fashion, such as their spellbook. Other classes, like the Cleric, will simply have access to all of the common spells on their spell list. Now, there is some nuance here. I'm not going to dig too deep into it, but some classes, like the Cleric, their magic is bestowed on them from another source, such as a deity. And it would be a little bit ridiculous to assume that a deity wouldn't have access to all of the divine spells. So in general, some classes, such as the Cleric, have very broad access to the whole of their spell list. For some classes, as long as a spell is a common spell on that spell list, they have the potential to prepare it at the start of the day. Now, every tradition of magic is going to have some spells on its spell list that are considered uncommon or rare. The default assumption of the game is that prepared spellcasters do not automatically have access to those spells. They must research them or receive them as a reward in some fashion before they can prepare them, just like a wizard would need to write an uncommon spell in their spellbook before they could prepare it. But for the most part, uncommon and rare spells, that's not going to show up very often inside the game. Most of the spells are going to be common, so classes like the Cleric and Druid, they just have access to the majority of their spell list straight out of the gate. On the other side of the spellcasting spectrum is the spontaneous caster. The spontaneous caster has the notable advantage of they don't have to assign their spells at the start of the day. The spontaneous caster just has a list of spells that they know, and they have a set of spell slots available, and as long as the spell slot is a suitable spell rank for whatever spell the caster intends to use, then they can just freely put the spell in that spell slot and fire it off. A spell slot is not locked in for a spontaneous caster the way that it is for a prepared caster, and that's one of the huge advantages of a spontaneous casting class. If the spontaneous caster knows the spell Haste and the spell Fireball and has 3 spell slots available, well, during the day, they could cast Haste 3 times, or they could cast Fireball 3 times, or they could cast any combination of the two a total of 3 times. The spell slots are flexible and open to whatever use that caster considers appropriate during the adventuring day. Spontaneous casters have flexibility in the application of their spell slots, and allow me to say, if you are a first-time player who has not done spellcasters before, it is my general experience that most players who are playing a spellcaster for the first time usually prefer the spontaneous casters over the prepared casters, just because that flexibility in using the spell slot is really, really nice. The prepared caster getting locked out of using their spells because they prepared the wrong spell is a feel-bad situation, especially for new players. So if you've never done any spellcasters before and you're not sure which one sounds more appealing, I would give serious consideration to a spontaneous casting class, because I've seen that new players tend to prefer those. However, all of the flexibility that's found in a spontaneous casting class does come with what I think is a very obvious downside, in that spontaneous spellcasters don't actually have access to their whole spell list. Theoretically they do. A bard accesses the occult spell list. All of the spells from the occult tradition are potentially something that a bard can know, but when you actually lay out how many spells the bard does know, that's where the restriction comes in. Typically, the majority of spontaneous spellcasters are going to know a number of spells in a given rank equal to the number of spell slots they have in that rank. Additionally, a lot of classes cap out at 3 spell slots for a given rank, which means it doesn't really matter how many first rank spells there are in the occult spell tradition, the bard is going to know a maximum of 3 of them. Yes, they can use those 3 in any combination that they want, but they effectively can't access the rest of the spells in the tradition. For all of the flexibility in how spontaneous casters apply their spell slots, they have a lot of restrictions on how they access spells, and that is the trade-off of spontaneous spellcasters. Now, there's one thing that I haven't discussed yet that we'll get into here in a moment, and that is the idea of heightening spells. Later in this video, we'll talk about the fact that spells can be heightened from one spell rank to another. So, for example, Fireball, a 3rd rank spell, could be used as a 4th rank spell as well. When it comes to heightening, prepared spellcasters actually have the advantage here. Spontaneous spellcasters, when they know a spell at a very specific rank. So, for example, if a sorcerer knows Fireball, they know Fireball as a 3rd rank spell, meaning that anytime they cast Fireball, it's going to be cast using a 3rd level spell slot. That is the only place they can use it. However, a wizard or druid that knows Fireball, if they have higher rank spell slots available, they can prepare Fireball in the normal 3rd rank, or they could prepare it at a higher rank, and in so doing, they would get the benefits of using those higher rank spell slots for that Fireball spell. You can think of it as some spells with a little time and preparation can have more powerful effects, but it is the prepared spellcasting classes that have the ability to use that time and preparation to get those extra effects out of the spell. Now, that doesn't leave spontaneous casters high and dry on the subject of heightened spells, but we'll get back to that in a moment. Before we leave this distinction between prepared and spontaneous spellcasters, I do want to note that the book Secrets of Magic does introduce a kind of blended spellcasting called flexible preparation. This can be found starting on page 208 of the book Secrets of Magic, and this is an alternate rule set that can be applied to any prepared spellcasting class, such as a wizard, a witch, a cleric, or a druid. I hope to go into the rules for flexible spell preparation a little more in depth in a future video. I feel like that's a little too complex for our current conversation, but if you're interested in reading up on that blended approach to spellcasting, you can check that out in Secrets of Magic. Alright, now let's step back and talk a little bit more about heightening spells. We've already discussed the fact that spell slots can be divided up into ranks that start from the weakest rank 1 spell slot going up to 2nd, 3rd, 4th, all the way up to the most powerful 10th rank of spells. The idea behind heightening a spell is the idea that you can take a spell that would normally be in one spell rank of spell slots, and you can cast that spell using a higher rank of a spell slot in order to get a stronger effect out of it. Going back to the classic example of Fireball, Fireball is normally a 3rd rank spell, and it produces a large explosion of fire, so if you were to take Fireball and pack it into a higher rank spell slot, you are essentially producing a larger and more powerful explosion when you throw out that higher rank Fireball. Now, there is a very important thing I want to discuss here, because this is an aspect of the rules that a lot of people overlook, but there are some niche cases where this is very important, and that is, any spell in Pathfinder 2e can be heightened. You can take any spell in Pathfinder 2nd Edition and heighten it to a higher rank of spell. I don't care what spell we're talking about, any spell can go higher. Now, the reason a lot of people don't realize this is, heightening a spell is not automatically going to strengthen a spell. When you heighten a spell, you only get improved effects if the spell directly tells you that heightening the spell improves it. Does that seem a little strange? Let me explain. There is a rule called counteracting that we are not going to dive into in this video, but one of the things that counteracting cares about in Pathfinder 2e is the rank of the spell that is being counteracted, or the rank of the spell that is being used to counteract something. So there may be some instances, especially when you're thinking about counteracting a spell, or when you're worried that someone might be thinking about counteracting your spell, there may be instances where you deliberately use a higher rank spell slot, not because you actually want a more powerful effect, but because you are concerned about the interactions of a counteract. Again, we're not going to deep dive counteracting in this video, but just be aware that any spell in Pathfinder 2e can be heightened, but it only gets a more powerful benefit if the spell directly notes a benefit for being heightened. We'll get into reading a spell entry later in this video, but be aware that on any spell that has an improved effect when heightened, that there will be a specific section at the bottom of the spell entry that will note what the heightened effects are. There are a couple of types of nomenclature that you might see. One is going to be a heightened +1 or heightened +2, and the other nomenclature that you might see would be heightened 3rd or heightened 4th, something like that. A good example of a heightened +1 would be the cantrip Electric Arc, and a good example of a heightened +2 would be the cantrip Caustic Blast. What the heightened +1 or heightened +2 means is, anytime you increase the spell rank of the spell by that amount, you are functionally gaining whatever improvement is noted in that heightened section. So on Electric Arc, where it says heightened +1, every time you increase the effective spell rank of that cantrip by 1 rank, so when you go from 1st rank to 2nd rank, you gain that +1 benefit. Later, if you go from 2nd rank to 3rd rank, you gain that benefit again, and all of those benefits will be cumulative. However, when you take a look at the cantrip Caustic Blast, it notes heightened +2, which means that you need to increase the effective spell rank by 2 before you gain that benefit. So if Caustic Blast goes from 1st rank to 2nd rank, there's no change, but then when it goes from 2nd rank to 3rd rank, you get the benefit. Nothing happens at 4th rank, but when you go up to 5th rank, the benefit happens again, it's cumulative, on up all the way through the effective spell ranks of your spells. Anytime you see a heightened +1, a heightened +2, any kind of nomenclature like that, that just tells you when you increase it this far, you get this effect, and those effects are cumulative if you go far enough. The other nomenclature you might see is going to mention specific spell ranks, and the cantrip Detect Magic is a good example of this. Detect Magic is going to unlock specific benefits at 3rd rank, and then later it unlocks additional benefits at 4th rank. So whenever you hit those ranks, Detect Magic gains those benefits, but at 2nd rank it doesn't get anything extra, and if Detect Magic goes past 4th rank, it's not going to be building anything else on top of it. So at 4th rank it gets its last bonus ability, and 5th, 6th, 7th on up, nothing additional is going to happen. Now for prepared spellcasters, this means that you just want to ask yourself, do I want the extra benefit from heightening when I'm preparing my spell? When I lay out my spell slots at the start of the day, I can look at what spells I have available at which ranks, and if I'm so inclined, I can move a spell up to a higher rank and get the appropriate heightened benefit for doing so. Prepared spellcasters just look at their options and decide, which one do I want? Spontaneous spellcasters, as I've already noted, they know their spells at very specific ranks. As a result, they don't get to automatically move spells up to new ranks. Their spells are stuck at whatever rank they know, but there's a very common class feature that you need to be aware of. It's usually called signature spells. The Signature Spells class feature is included with most spontaneous casting classes as a way to let them heighten some of their spells. You'll need to read up on the specifics of your class if it has this feature, but typically what it's going to do is it's going to allow you to pick one spell of every rank that you know, and you get to label that spell as a signature spell. If a spell is labeled as a signature spell, the spontaneous caster has the option to freely move that spell to a higher spell slot anytime that they are so inclined. So normally, if a sorcerer can cast Fireball, they could only use a 3rd rank spell slot to do so. But if Fireball were a signature spell for the sorcerer, they could freely use a 4th rank, 5th rank, on up however high they can go, and they would gain whatever the normal heightened benefits are. There is also a sneaky benefit of signature spells that some people miss, which is you can also freely lower a signature spell as long as the rank of the spell slot that you're using would be appropriate to your signature spell. Now this isn't something that's going to happen super often, but let's say that you're playing a spontaneous spellcaster and there are 4 spells at a given level that you want, but you only have 3 that you can actually put into your spell repertoire. Well, what you can actually do is take that 4th spell, that extra one that doesn't fit in your collection, and you can bump it up to a higher spell rank as a spell that you know. So for example, the Bard normally has access to Soothe as a 1st level spell. However, the Bard could move Soothe up and make it a 2nd rank spell instead. Then, if the Bard made Soothe a 2nd rank signature spell, they could freely, at any time they so choose, use a 1st rank spell to cast Soothe because it's appropriate for the spell. They can freely use 1st or 2nd level to cast it, regardless of where it actually appears in their spells known. The reason that I mention Soothe is, oftentimes with spontaneous classes, healing spells are really great spells to bump up to the highest rank of spell that you can cast, and then designate as a signature spell, so that you can use lower ranked spell slots when it's appropriate, but then you also have those high rank healing options for when you truly need them. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about is a broad category of magical abilities that can be considered the almost spells. You may have noticed in the discussion of heightening spells that I threw out a word that is common to a lot of spellcasting classes. That word is the word cantrip. Cantrips are an example of what I call almost spells. They read like spells, they look like spells, they have a lot of the same requirements as spells, but unlike normal spells, they don't use a spell slot. There are numerous effects in Pathfinder 2nd Edition that are very, very similar to spellcasting, but that don't actually qualify as spellcasting. They often use a lot of the same rules as spellcasting, and a lot of the touchstones for understanding them are going to be the same as spellcasting. The 3 primary examples of almost spellcasting are cantrips, focus spells, and innate spells. There's a 4th category that we're not going to discuss in this video called whatever it is that the kineticist does. If you really want to dive into that headache, Rage of Elements page 13 is where that discussion begins, but for now we're going to stay at the 3 simplest versions. Cantrips, focus spells, and innate spells mimic spellcasting in a lot of different ways, but they have some unique rules that set them apart as well. First up are cantrips. Cantrips are minor magical tricks that mimic the effects of spells in a lot of ways. And we've already mentioned a few examples of these: Electric Arc, Caustic Blast, Detect Magic. All of these are cantrips that most of your spellcasting classes are going to be able to use. Now, cantrips are going to function a lot like spell slots for prepared and spontaneous casters. If you're a prepared caster, you need to prepare your cantrips for the day. You have so many that you can prepare and you pick out which ones you want. If you're a spontaneous caster, you have a certain number of cantrips in your repertoire, and those are the ones that you have access to. However, the big thing that distinguishes a cantrip from a spell slot is, well, cantrips don't use spell slots. They don't really use anything. They are minor magical abilities, and as a result, a spellcaster, or anyone who has access to one, can use them over and over again without limit. Sure, you need to cast them normally, but if you want to throw out an Electric Arc spell on the first round of combat, on the second, third, fourth round of combat, you can keep spamming Electric Arc and nothing's stopping you. One of the big things that distinguishes the cantrip from the regular spell slot is the fact that someone who has a cantrip has an unlimited use ability that they can just use over and over again throughout the day. From a game design perspective, what this means is your typical spellcasting class is going to have a couple of minor tricks that they always have up their sleeve that they can pull out during an emergency. Sure, I may have already burned my 3rd level spell slot, I can't cast Fireball anymore, but I can keep throwing out a minor ignition spell during combat so that I still have some magical damage available to me. The other thing worth noting about cantrips is, in the vast majority of cases, they are going to auto-heighten. What that means is, at first level, a cantrip is considered to be about as powerful as a first-rank spell slot. However, as your character levels up, as you learn new spell slots, or as your character just grows in power in general, your cantrip is automatically going to heighten from 1st rank to 2nd rank to 3rd rank, potentially all the way up to 10th rank at the highest of levels, and your cantrip is naturally going to grow in the power of its effects over the course of play. A cantrip is never going to be as powerful as the effect of a spell slot at the same rank, because a spell slot is a specific resource that a spellcaster must expend. But one of the cool things about cantrips is you always have access to them, and they're always growing at least a little bit over the course of your character's progression. The next set of almost spells worth discussing are called focus spells, or at least in the generic sense they're called focus spells. Focus spells are best thought of as class-specific spells. And part of what that means is every class that has access to class-specific spells is going to confuse you just a little bit by having class-specific names for their class-specific spells. So, for example, the focus spells for rangers are known as warden spells. Other classes will call their focus spells other things, but regardless of what a class calls its focus spells, it's always going to follow the same rules. Focus spells are not cast using spell slots, rather focus spells are cast using focus points. Whenever you gain your first focus spell, you gain a pool of focus points, and when you gain that first focus spell, you have 1 focus point. Anytime you would gain a new focus spell, you gain another focus point, and your pool increases in size up to a maximum of 3. So, if you have a total of 3 focus spells, you have 3 focus points in your focus point pool. However, if you go past 3 focus spells, you do not get to increase your focus point pool any higher. So if you get 4, 5, or 6 focus spells from whatever source, you would still keep that cap of 3 focus points in your pool. Whenever you want to cast a focus spell, you would do any actions normally, but instead of expending a spell slot, you expend a focus point in order to cast the spell. Now, there are a few special rules that surround focus spells, but probably one of the most important is this: focus spells are rechargeable. These class-specific spells and options are intended to be something that your class can do repeatedly throughout the day. You just need to refocus in order to get your focus points back. Refocus is an exploration activity. It takes 10 minutes to perform, and when you refocus, you refill your focus pool by 1 up to whatever its normal maximum would be. Now, the specifics of the refocus activity vary from class to class. Basically, the rule here is, in order to refocus, you need to spend some time doing something that is appropriate to your class, whatever the case may be. So, for example, if you're a cleric or a champion, you may need to spend 10 minutes in prayer. Whereas if you're a wizard, you may need to spend 10 minutes poring over your spell book and studying arcane tomes, and a bard may need to spend 10 minutes playing music or doing something creative. Whatever your class is, your refocus activity just needs to match the flavor of the class in question. The base rules, however, are simple and straightforward. If you've spent some focus points, you can spend 10 minutes refocusing, and you get a point back. Also worth noting, you can refocus multiple times in a row in order to regain multiple points. So, if all 3 of your focus points are gone, you can spend 30 minutes refocusing and fill that pool back up to normal. The next thing worth noting about focus spells is, just like cantrips, focus spells are going to auto-heighten. So if you get a focus spell as a first level character, it's going to be considered the equivalent of a first rank spell, but as you level up, it's naturally going to increase in power to second rank, third rank, fourth rank, on up, as we've already discussed. The only thing to be careful about here is, when you're reading a focus spell description, remember to consider what rank the focus spell starts at. Many focus spells start out as the equivalent of a first rank spell, but there are other focus spells that are higher level. You might have second rank, third rank, fourth rank focus spells, and those focus spells will still auto-heighten. Just remember, when you're doing the auto-heightening, it's from whatever the normal baseline is. If a focus spell starts out as the equivalent of a 4th rank spell, when it becomes a 5th rank spell, you would only apply the heightened effect for having gone up 1 rank, because that's how far it's gone. Now, another thing that focus spells and cantrips have in common is neither of these class features qualify as spellcasting. So if you're ever in a situation where spellcasting is a prerequisite for something, be aware that if you have cantrips and or focus spells, but not actual spell slots, then you don't have the spellcasting ability. Also, one more note I want to throw about cantrips and focus spells in here. A lot of classes do this really weird thing where they have unique cantrips that share a name with their focus spells, even though they're cantrips, not focus spells. A good example of this is the Bard. Bards have composition cantrips, which are unique cantrips and use the rules for cantrips, and then they also have focus spells that are called composition spells. Even though they both have the word composition, they are 2 different things. The composition cantrips are cantrips and function as cantrips. The composition spells are focus spells and function as focus spells. It's a little bit of a naming convention that Paizo does that bothers me, so just be aware of that if you're reading up on a particular class. The final type of almost spells I want to talk about in this video is called Innate Spells. Now, normally Innate Spells is the department of monsters. It's something that the Game Master needs to think about, but not something that players really need to consider. However, there are a lot of ancestry options in Pathfinder 2e that are going to allow certain ancestries to access certain spells. So for example, you could be playing an elven fighter who naturally has a cantrip and maybe a 1st or 2nd rank spell through their ancestry feats. They don't have any actual spell casting from their class, they're not considered a spellcaster, but they still have some innate spells that they can use. Again, like cantrips and focus spells, These innate spells are going to reference a lot of the same rules that a normal spell slot would reference, but they have their own specific rules that govern when and how they are used. If your character has innate spells for any reason, there are a few things you need to know. First off, unless otherwise noted, all innate spells are going to be based off of charisma. That means that even if you have spells normally from another source, and those spells use a different mental attribute, you still use charisma for your innate spells. If you're playing an elven wizard, their wizard spells use intelligence, but if they have innate spells from their ancestry feats, the innate spells will use charisma instead. Also, when it comes to innate spells, assuming that you're not playing a spellcasting class, some of the mechanics of the spell may be in question. Well, when it comes to determining how powerful a spell is, how well you can use it, or how hard it is to resist, essentially, innate spells, you are considered trained in those spells starting at first level, and you move up to expert proficiency in those spells starting at 12th level. You never get master or legendary proficiency with innate spells unless it is specifically noted otherwise by something inside of the game. Again, the vast majority of innate spells are going to belong to monsters, not player characters. This is not a huge concern for most players. It is something that you want to be aware of. The last couple of notes are this: if your player does have innate spells for some reason, innate spells cannot be heightened and never use spell slots. That last point is particularly important. Let's say you have a first level innate spell as a result of an ancestry feat. If you later gain access to first level spell slots, you cannot put that spell into a spell slot. That spell has its own rules about when and how it's used, and those rules are self-contained. That doesn't prevent you from accessing the same spell for your spell slot through other means, but just remember, your innate spells are their own thing and they always stay by themselves. Okay, so we've spent a lot of time discussing what spellcasting is and what looks like spellcasting, but we haven't actually discussed casting the spells yet. So let's move on to what it actually takes to cast a spell and what it looks like when you cast a spell. In general, when you cast a spell, there are three things that are always going to be true. First, your character must make gestures of some kind in order to channel and direct the spell. Exactly what those gestures look like are up to creative interpretation between you and your storyteller, but the general rule is a spellcaster needs to make gestures in order to direct the magic. Next up, the spellcaster must mutter incantations in order to direct the magic as well. Exactly what these incantations sound like, exactly how they're used, again, there's a lot of creative liberty offered here, but your character must be able to speak in some fashion in order to, again, bring the magic to fruition. The final thing worth noting is, when you cast a spell, it is obvious. Spellcasting is not subtle in Pathfinder 2e. As I've already noted, Pathfinder allows a great deal of freedom in terms of describing what spellcasting is going to look like, but one thing that's worth noting is there are going to be obvious and very observable manifestations of spellcasting. The classic example of this is a swirl of magical runes that surrounds your character as the magic builds and is ultimately released. So, anytime that you use spellcasting, be aware of the fact that your character is actively gesturing, is actively speaking, and is actively producing results that observers are going to be able to recognize as coming from your character. Now, it is worth noting that Paizo does offer some creative license here. For example, does gesturing mean that your character has to have their hands free, or could your character effectively gesture using a wand or a magical staff? As long as your game master is okay with that, yeah, that's perfectly fine. It's worth noting that there is a storyline reason that one of my wizards in a Pathfinder 2e game actually has to use his wizard staff in order to make gestures for some of his spells. Now, that's not a distinct rule that's in Pathfinder 2e, that's something I worked out with my storyteller, but in the case of certain spells, I actually need the staff in order to perform the correct gestures. The book also notes that if your character is unable to speak for some reason, that you can work out some sort of alternative way to make sounds that your character uses in order to channel magic. They offer the ideas that maybe your character whistles in order to channel magic, or maybe your character drums on something in order to channel the magic. As long as there is an audible sound of some kind and you and your storyteller agree on it, it counts for purposes of this. Just remember, you gotta make gestures, you gotta make sounds, and when you do it, there's going to be very obvious magical results that label you as the spellcaster. Now, I'll go ahead and note here that there is a sidebar in this section of the player core that talks about a trait that spells can have called subtle. I'm saving a deep discussion of traits for a future video, but it is worth noting if a spell has the subtle trait, and a good example is the spell invisibility, this means that you can cast the spell without making the dramatic gestures, without producing the dramatic sounds, and that there are no obvious visible manifestations that tell observers, hey, they're using a spell right now. So if you're wondering about subtle uses of magic, there is a particular trait that denotes when magic would be subtle, and there are some options in the game that you can use to make certain spells gain the subtle trait if you're trying to hide these aspects of spellcasting. Moving into some of the more mechanically defined aspects of spellcasting, there are certain resources that you must commit and expend in order to cast a spell. Now, the most obvious resource is the one that I've mentioned many times in this video already, the spell slot. In order to cast a spell, you must commit and expend that spell slot in the casting of the spell. If you're doing something like a focus spell, you're not going to be expending a spell slot, but you are going to be expending a focus point. It kind of covers the same territory, but again, it's something that you must commit and expend as part of casting the spell. Another thing that you need to commit and expend is at least one action. Now, most spells in Pathfinder 2e are going to take 2 actions to cast, and when you read a spell entry, it's going to tell you exactly how many actions it takes to cast. Although, I guess I should edit a little bit. Some spells can be cast as reactions as well, but again, typical spells you're going to be looking at 1, usually 2, or maybe 3 actions in order to cast them. In order to cast the spell, you have to commit yourself to spending all of the necessary actions. Additionally, some spells may require what are known as costs or loci. A cost is some kind of material thing that you need to produce while you are casting the spell, and a loci is, again, a material thing that you produce while casting the spell, but unlike a cost, it's more of a permanent item. So, when you go to cast a spell, you need to commit a certain number of actions, you need to potentially commit a spell slot or a focus point, and if there are any costs or loci, you are going to draw them as part of spending your actions and present them for the spell. And once you have committed and produced all of those things, at the end of that process, the spell will take effect. Now, I know a lot of that sounds self-explanatory, but it is important to be aware of that whole package because of one very important reason, which is disrupting spells. Now, the disrupting rules for Pathfinder 2e appear on page 415 of the player core. That's outside of the section that we're looking at today, so I'm not going to dive too deep into the disrupting rules. I will say the disrupting rules seem like they don't come up nearly as much in Pathfinder 2e as they do other TTRPGs. It doesn't seem like it's a very common thing, and it doesn't seem like Paizo intended for it to be a very common thing. It can happen, but it doesn't seem like it happens as much. Still, you will want to be familiar with the disrupting rules, and what you need to be aware of is this: if, for any reason, a spell is disrupted, you lose everything that you committed when you attempted to cast that spell. So, for example, if I go to cast a spell and a fighter uses a reactive strike and it causes my spell to be disrupted, I would lose all of the actions I had committed. I would still expend that spell slot, and if I produced any cost associated with the spell, those would also be burned up in my attempt to cast, even though the spell was disrupted. Now, loci are a little different. Loci are permanent items that can be used over and over again, so those aren't expended when you cast a spell, so they wouldn't be expended if the spell was disrupted, but you still would have taken the time to get that loci out when you tried to cast it. Just be aware that when it comes to casting a spell, you commit everything up front, and then it either all gets used and the spell goes off, or it all gets disrupted and all gets lost. The final thing worth noting when it comes to casting spells is that you will need what's known as line of effect to your target. Again, the rules for this appear outside of the section that we're discussing today, and it's another one of those set of rules that I don't feel like comes up super often, but if you're interested in the line of effect rules, those are found on page 426 of the Player Core, so you can go look those up if you want more information on that. Just as a general statement, be aware that in addition to making gestures and sounds and producing cost and spending actions, you also need a line of effect to your target in order for the spell to go off. Okay, so that's casting spells. Now let's talk about reading spells. I'm going to be throwing up on the screen a spell entry for the spell Forbidding Ward. Now, quick note, the Forbidding Ward spell that I'm going to be showing you comes from the pre-remaster spell cards, which means that the spell entry that you're looking at is not a perfect copy of the remastered spell entries, but it's extremely close to what you're going to see on remastered spells, and this was the best image that I could find for this video, so it's what we got to work with. And don't worry, I'll highlight the things that are different as we go through. And honestly, the main thing that's different is going to appear at the very top of the spell entry. At the top of your spell entry, the first thing you have is the name of the spell, and on the remastered spell entries, next to that is going to be an action icon representing how many actions that you have to spend in order to cast the spell. Then, over at the top right of the spell entry, you will see the spell rank of the spell listed as well. Most spells are going to say Spell 1, Spell 2, Spell 3, indicating what rank the spell is, although with certain entries like Forbidding Ward, you will see the word cantrip in place of spell, because that's letting you know that this is a cantrip and it's going to use cantrip rules. Underneath that, you have a line, and then under that line, you're going to have some blocks that list the important traits of the spell. Now again, I'm saving traits for a future video. Some of the most important traits in spellcasting can be found in a box on page 301, so you may want to read up on those. But all of the important traits associated with the rules of a given spell will be listed right underneath the spell name. Next, you have a section labeled Traditions, and this is just going to list which traditions include this spell on their spell list. It may only list one tradition, it may list a couple, it could potentially list all four, depending upon which traditions normally use this spell. You will see on this pre-remaster card a cast section, where the actions used to be listed. The actions on remastered spells have been moved to the top of the spell entry, but it is worth noting there may still be a cast section anytime you have a spell that takes more than one turn to cast. So for example, if you have a spell with a casting time of 1 minute, that would be listed here. Then you have sections for the range, for the area, for the targets, and you may also see information listed for defense and duration. Then the spell entry is going to draw another line, and underneath that you're going to have the main block of text that describes what the spell does. Then you may have another line after the spell description, and below that line is going to be the section with all of the information for how the heightened versions of the spell might work. All of this information is pretty straightforward and fairly easy to read, and once you get used to a few stat blocks, you will very quickly be able to interpret new stat blocks, but there are a few things worth highlighting, so let's go ahead and talk about them. First up, let's talk about duration. Some spells are going to have an instantaneous duration, which means that as soon as you throw out the spell, it has its effect and then it goes away. And again, Fireball is a classic example of this, but many spells have a longer duration. A lot of spells in this game are going to have a duration of 10 rounds or 1 minute. That's something you will see a lot, but it's not necessarily true of every spell. Anytime a duration is longer than instantaneous, it will be noted here, and when you are counting duration, duration ticks down by 1 round at the start of every turn for you. So if a spell has a duration of 3 rounds, when you cast the spell and get around to your next turn, at the start of your next turn, it ticks down. Some spells under duration may note the word sustained. This means that a spell can last a certain duration, but that your character needs to sustain it every round in order for it to last up to that length of time. So if one of these spells is active, when it gets back around to your turn, what you need to do is you need to spend one of your 3 normal actions sustaining that spell to get its duration to continue to your next turn. The game does not note which of the 3 actions you need to spend, so it's not super important if it's a first action or second action or third action. Just as long as you spend an action to sustain the spell, it keeps going. But if you see that word sustained in the duration, that's what that means. Every round on your turn, you must spend an action in order to keep the spell going, and again, it still has that maximum duration that it can hit. Finally, this is not going to come up super often, but some spells can be dismissed. Dismiss is a specific activity that you can do, and if you want to end a spell early, you can spend actions to do the dismiss activity to end that spell early on your turn. Now let's talk about range, area, and targets. Some spells are going to be listed as having a range of touch, and that means exactly what you think it means. In order to cast a spell, you must touch the target. Now, if the target is willing, such as if you're using a healing spell, typically the assumption of the game is that you're going to be able to touch them automatically and there is no roll necessary, but oftentimes with offensive spells, if you want to touch the target, you will need to make a spell attack roll, and we'll talk about that more here in a moment. Beyond the range of touch, the range of the spell is going to be measured in a number of feet from your target. 5 feet, 10 feet, 500 feet, whatever the spell may be. It's going to be pretty plain, and it's going to be measured from wherever your character is standing, and the spell can be targeted anywhere up to that distance. Once a spell is targeted within its range, then you have to concern yourself with the area or targets of a spell. A spell can have an area, a spell can have targets, a spell can have both, or just one of the two. If the spell has both, all targets for the spell must be inside the area. If the spell only has an area and doesn't list targets, the assumption is that the spell affects every creature inside of the area. In terms of area, area can be divided into 4 possibilities. There are bursts, cones, lines, and emanations. So a cone is an area of magic that starts at your character and goes out at an angle to whatever the maximum distance of that cone is going to be. A line is a straight line of magic that again goes from your character out to the maximum extent of that line. The other 2 areas worth noting are the emanation and the burst. And basically these are circular areas of magic that affect everything kind of, well, in that emanation or that burst. The main difference between them is this: an emanation always measures from your character, whereas a burst is going to measure from a specific spot in the battlefield. So a 15-foot emanation is going to go out from around your character, whereas if a spell creates a 15-foot burst, you can pick any spot out to the maximum range of the spell, and then you have a 15-foot burst around wherever that spot happens to be. Now, this is a small thing, but it is a cool thing that I appreciate. When you talk about emanations and bursts in Pathfinder 2e, you're always talking about the radius of the circle. In older TTRPGs, some spells would have the radius of the effect, and some spells would have the diameter of the effect, and you had to pay attention to which one was being discussed. Pathfinder has simplified their nomenclature. Anytime you deal with an emanation or a burst, it's always going to be the radius, and you don't have to worry about clarifying that. It's a small thing that I didn't even notice until I was prepping this video, but now that I'm aware of it, thank you, Paizo. The final thing worth noting here is just the idea of targets. You will, with some spells, need to pay attention to the idea of valid targets and willing targets. Valid target just means that your spell will fail if you target the wrong thing. So, for example, if you have a spell that can only target living creatures, and you aim it at somebody, and you don't know that that particular person happens to be a vampire, the spell is automatically going to fail because that is not a valid target for the spell. If a spell has multiple targets, and some targets are valid and some targets are not, it will affect the valid targets and miss on the others. But just be aware that targeting the wrong thing can cause a spell to fail if the target is not valid. Sometimes spells will call attention to willing targets. A creature always decides whether or not it is willing to be affected by a spell, and regardless of where a creature is in an initiative count, they are still able to make that choice as a free action. So if my ally is going to cast a spell on me, even if it is not my turn, I can still declare that I am willing to be affected by that spell. Most of the time, willing is going to be a very obvious thing, but there could be circumstances where maybe a character doesn't know what spell is being cast or what somebody is trying to do, and in that instance they could decide, no, I'm not willing to be affected, and in such a case, they would not be a valid target because they're not a willing target. Also, under the discussion of valid targets, is the question of what about targets that your character can't necessarily see, but you might know roughly where they are. So for example, let's say that there is a creature inside that fog bank and you roughly know what direction they are, and you want to try to fire a spell at them, but you don't have clear line of sight. In this instance, it is up to the Game Master to decide if you have an appropriate line of effect or not. The Game Master will need to reference rules for perception and seeking, and kind of use those to determine whether or not they think your character could target that unseen creature. But I do think it's worth noting that even if you can't necessarily see a creature, there may still be a chance that you could target the creature if that line of effect would still be there, so that is something that you can kind of negotiate with your GM should the situation arise. Another thing that's noted in the spell entry is going to be defenses, and this is going to be relevant anytime you have an offensive spell that could harm or hinder another creature. If I throw a lightning bolt at my foe, I need a way to determine whether or not I effectively struck them. All creatures in Pathfinder 2e, be they player characters or monsters, effectively have 4 defenses: armor class, fortitude saves, reflex saves, and will saves. Every offensive spell in Pathfinder 2e is going to target one of these 4 things. Now, exactly which one is targeted and exactly how that targeting works will vary just a little bit, but be aware that every offensive spell is going to use one of these 4 defenses as a way of determining whether or not the spell takes hold or not. Now, in terms of the actual targeting, your character is going to have 2 stats somewhere on your character sheet. One is called your spell attack, the other one is called your spell DC. These will be calculated based on your character class progression, they will scale normally as you level, and those rules will be found in your class, but you're always going to use one of these 2 to determine if the spell takes hold or not. If a spell targets a creature's armor class, it's going to use your spell attack. If a spell targets a creature's fortitude, reflex, or will save, instead of rolling an attack roll, what's going to happen is the creature needs to make the appropriate saving throw against your spell DC. So in the defenses section, if it lists AC, that means you're making a spell attack against their AC, and if it mentions fortitude save, that means the creature that you're targeting needs to roll a fortitude save against your spell DC, and same thing for reflex or will save. If that's what's listed, then the creature needs to roll the appropriate save against whatever your spell DC happens to be. Now, both of these things are pretty straightforward, but there is some nuance here worth noting. First off, spell attack. Do you hear that word, attack? Remember that because Pathfinder 2nd Edition uses a multiple attack penalty. If you make a spell attack roll, that is going to count for calculating your multiple attack penalty later in the round. Now, as I mentioned before, most spells take 2 actions to cast, meaning that if you move and cast a spell, you're not going to be making a second attack most of the time, but because a spell attack does count as an attack, if you make another attack later in the round, you do take the multiple attack penalty, And if you made an attack earlier in the round, your spell attack will be hindered by that multiple attack penalty. In other words, if you're going to throw out a spell attack, you're probably going to want to do that first because that multiple attack penalty can be pretty tough. The other thing worth noting about this defenses section is this is low-key one of the most important ways of maintaining the overall power balance of your spellcaster. You see, martial characters almost always have to target just the armor class of the creature in question. They may be able to use Intimidate against a will DC or something like that, but generally speaking, if a martial character wants to take something down, they have to go against armor class. As a spellcaster, you have a lot more versatility built into this incredible array of spells that your character can use. Is a creature's armor class really high, but it also has a terrible will save? Well, then don't use your spell attack spells, throw out something that targets the will save, and the creature is very likely to be affected. Is the creature large and bulky and clumsy? Target its reflex save and it's probably going to take a lot of damage. Versatility is one of the primary strengths of spellcasting classes, so when you are selecting your spells, you want to keep an eye on the defense section of the spells that you are picking, and make sure that you're targeting different defenses so that you have options that allow you to go after whatever the weak point of your target happens to be. Also, I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here, but if you're considering playing a spellcaster and you've read anything online about Pathfinder 2e, you've probably heard something to the effect of spellcasters just aren't that strong. Now, personally, I disagree, but part of where that perception comes in is the spell attack and spell DC that you have as a spellcaster. You can miss a spell attack, and creatures can have a success or a critical success when they make saving throws against your spells. When those things happen, your spell has a diminished effect or maybe no effect whatsoever, and the likely 2 actions you just poured into casting that spell can feel kind of pointless. What that means is, as a spellcaster, you typically don't want to lead with your big spells. A full-powered creature is more likely to resist your big spells and more likely to fully resist your big spells, meaning that if you throw out a big spell early, the likelihood of that spell fizzling is higher. However, there is a tactic called debuffing that is very effective. If you or some of your party manages to throw out an effective debuff, maybe in the form of Intimidation or maybe in the form of some weaker spells that you fire off first, if you can hinder your target's armor class, fortitude save, reflex save, or will save, then those lower target numbers will make your bigger spells more effective when you throw them out later. So when you consider defenses, you want to make sure, 1, that you have a variety of spells that can target a variety of defenses, and 2, you want to remember, don't lead with your big spells, but beat the enemy down a bit first, debuff them, penalize their defenses, and then you are in a position that your big spells are much more likely to land and have a major effect. One last thing before we leave defenses, something you may see on a spell entry is the idea of a basic saving throw. You may see basic fortitude save, basic reflex save, basic will save. This is a space-saving convention that Paizo has built into their spell entries, which basically means if a creature makes a saving throw against a damaging spell, there is a normal distribution based on the outcome of that saving throw of how the damage will be applied. If a creature rolls a critical success on their saving throw, they take no damage on a basic save. If they roll a success, they take half damage on their basic save. If they roll a failure, they take full damage on the basic save, and if they roll a critical failure, they take double damage instead. So anytime you see basic saving throw, fortitude, reflex, or will, that's what that means. Alright, now that we've talked about reading a spell entry, I want to step back out and take a bigger picture look at some important concepts for understanding spells, and that is the idea of the 4 magical essences and the 4 magical traditions. Now, between these two concepts, mechanically, the 4 magical traditions is the important part, but we need to talk about the essences first to understand what the traditions are. In terms of the creative lore of Pathfinder 2e, all magic can be divided into 4 essences, representing the kinds of energy or effects that the magic has. These essences are matter, mind, spirit, and life. Matter essence, which can also be known as body, material, or even physical essence, represents magic that manipulates the physical world in some way. If I change this chair into a table, I am modifying its material properties, and that makes it a matter spell. By the way, it's also worth noting that matter in this instance also covers manipulating the energy inside of objects, meaning that matter spells also cover what I call the boom spells. So if it manipulates fire or lightning or something like that, that is classified as matter as well, even if it's not strictly a physical object. So that's your first category. Some spells manipulate the essence of matter, and then for the second essence, some spells manipulate the essence of mind. Mind essence can also be known as thought, mental, or astral essence, and this represents magic that deals with essentially the power of thought. The ability to know and uncover and discover things, the ability to discern things, all of this falls under the purview of mind magic. Next to mind magic, but much less clearly defined, is the spirit essence, which is also known as the soul or ethereal essence, covers the immortal soul, the part of the creature that extends beyond death and that passes through the ethereal plane and into the great beyond. The spirit essence is the hardest to describe and quite possibly the least understood, but still quite powerful. And then, last but not least, we have the fourth essence, which is life essence. This can also be known as heart, faith, instinct, or my personal favorite, vital essence, and this refers to magic that directly deals with the animating force behind living creatures. So anything that heals a creature, or makes a creature stronger, or allows a creature to change shape, all of these can fall under what is classically known as the life essence. All spells, in terms of their flavor, typically fall under one of these 4 categories: matter, mind, spirit, or life, and as a result of these 4 categories are then divided out among what are known as the 4 magical traditions, and this is where it gets mechanical. A tradition is a description of the spell list that your spellcaster has access to. The 4 spell traditions are arcane, divine, occult, and primal. So, for example, the wizard is an arcane spellcaster, meaning they use the arcane tradition and all of the spells that fall under the arcane tradition spell list. The druid is a primal spellcaster, so they use the primal tradition and all of the spells that fall under the primal spell list. Every spellcasting class is going to use one of these 4 traditions, and as a result, every spellcasting class is going to have a specific list of spells that they can access throughout the course of their career. Now, how are these spell lists built? That's where the essences come back in. Every tradition, in terms of its flavor, is constructed by 2 of the 4 essences we've previously discovered. So, the arcane tradition uses the matter and mind essences, the divine tradition uses the spirit and life essences, the occult tradition uses the spirit and mind essences, and the primal tradition uses the matter and life essences. What you may notice here is each of the traditions has a unique combination of 2 essences that are used to build their spell list. So as a result, every tradition is going to overlap with 2 other traditions, but because of the way that they overlap, no 2 traditions are going to have an identical spell list. The arcane tradition uses matter and mind. They share the matter essence with the primal spell list, meaning that the arcane spell list about halfway overlaps with primal, but then they also have the mind essence, which means the arcane tradition also halfway overlaps with the occult tradition, which also uses the mind essence. So, how do these spell lists stack up? Now, this is a very generalized discussion, but in general, if you are looking at an arcane spellcasting class, you are looking at one of the more rational and logical versions of a spellcasting class, and because of their use of mind and its analytical properties, and the incredible variety of matter or material things found in the environment, this results in the arcane spell tradition being the broadest of the spell traditions. Essentially, the arcane tradition comes with the most options. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you have the divine tradition, which is bestowed on your character as a reward for your service, usually to a deity. The divine tradition has the life and spirit essences, and the way I look at the divine tradition, you can think of divine magic as a reward for service to a deity, and because it's a reward for service to a deity, the magic is naturally inclined towards service to others. Spirit magic and life magic are often used to buff, heal, or aid your allies and ensure that your team is functioning at full capacity. The occult tradition exists halfway between arcane and divine, as it has the mind and spirit essences, but lacks matter and life. Now, what you may notice about mind and spirit is how intangible both of these things are. The occult tradition is the most bizarre, it is the most unexplained, in part because the full scope of the tradition rests on magic that is not tangible in the real world. Oftentimes, occult magic is very good at buffing allies, it is very good at uncovering secrets, and I like to say it this way, occult magic is the mind game magic of Pathfinder 2e. If you want to get into a mental duel with an opponent, the occult tradition is the natural fit for you, but if you're looking for magic that has a real-world effect, the occult tradition's not going to be so strong. On the opposite side from the occult tradition, you have the primal tradition, which is all about the real, tangible world. You have matter essence, you have vital essence, both representing real things in the world in front of you. The ground, the plants, the trees, the allies that you have. The primal tradition has numerous ways to impact the battlefield, to take care of their allies, to physically affect the environment around them, but because the primal tradition ignores spirit and mind, they have very few options for dealing with the mental aspect of the game. So that is a picture of what the four essences are and how they are used to build the four traditions in the associated spell list. Whenever you pick a class in Pathfinder 2e, you will have one of these four traditions, and as a result, you will have a certain spell list composed of spells from these thematic elements. And so with that, we've actually covered the majority of the really important content found in pages 297 to 303 of the Player Core 1. We've actually hit most of the really big details, but there are a few miscellaneous items that are discussed in those pages that I want to draw attention to really quick. Now, some of the miscellaneous details I'm not going to be covering in this video because honestly I feel they deserve their own discussion. So for example, the idea of traits, the idea of spell shape, and the idea of counteracting are all topics I'm going to discuss in a future video. I will note, on the subject of counteracting, there is a discussion of the counteracting rules on page 431 of the Player Core, and as part of that discussion, Paizo has given us an extremely useful table that did not exist in the pre-remaster rules. Paizo, thank you so much for that table. If you're going to be playing a spellcaster, I would recommend printing out that counteracting table because counteracting rules don't come up super often, and it's one of those rules that just kind of exists in that headspace of the next time you need this is going to be right after you forget how it works. So that counteracting table is just a huge thank you to Paizo. I'm glad they included it. Again, we'll actually talk about counteracting rules in a future video, but do be aware of that table on page 431. If you're playing a spellcaster, I would recommend printing it out. You will get some use out of that. In terms of some of the other miscellaneous topics that are discussed, one of the things that's mentioned is the idea of identifying spells. And there is a rule here that I honestly never knew until I was studying this video, which is, if you have a spell prepared or in your spell repertoire, you automatically identify it when you see it cast. So if I have the spell Fireball prepared and I see an enemy wizard over there charging up a fireball, I know what's coming. And it doesn't matter if I have Fireball at 3rd rank and they've heightened it up to 7th rank. If they're casting Fireball and I've got it in my spells prepared or in my spell repertoire, I automatically identify the spell being cast. The only time you need to roll in order to identify a spell is if you don't have it on the list of spells you have prepared or on the list of spells in your spell repertoire. However, if the spell is not in your list of spells prepared or in your spell repertoire, you must spend an action in order to identify whatever spell is in effect. Practically what that means is, you normally can't use actions outside of your turn, meaning that if someone is casting a spell and you don't already know what it is, normally you're not going to be able to identify that spell as it's being cast. Now, assuming that the spell has a duration and the effects are going to linger for some period of time, you can totally spend an action on your turn to go ahead and identify what spell it was that other person threw out or what spell it is that's in the area. You can identify a lingering spell on your turn, but the normal identify spell action is not quick enough to identify a spell during the cast if you don't already have the appropriate spell prepared. To that effect, this is technically not mentioned in the section that we're discussing today, but there is a general skill feat called Recognize Spell that allows you to attempt to identify a spell as it's being cast as a reaction. So if you're concerned about reacting to spells as the enemy caster is bringing them into effect, the Recognize Spell general skill feat is something you may seriously want to consider picking up. Another miscellaneous topic discussed in this section is the idea of hostile actions. Many spells make reference to the idea of a hostile action. Maybe they hinder hostile actions, or maybe the spell breaks if a hostile action occurs, and so there is a little bit of a discussion of what the phrase hostile action means, and there are kind of two criteria that you need to consider to determine whether or not a spell is a hostile action. The first criteria is this: a hostile action is any action that can directly or indirectly cause harm to someone else. Now, directly is obvious. If I fire a lightning bolt at someone, that is a hostile action. The indirectly part is a little bit vague and a little bit more open to interpretation, but if the consequences of an action would foreseeably lead to harm to somebody else, it should be interpreted as a hostile action. So, for example, if I'm going to open a cage and unleash a tiger, that can perceivably lead to harm, so it should be interpreted as a hostile action. If an action directly or indirectly would lead to harm of another creature, that is considered a hostile action, and then the second test is the test of whether or not a creature is aware or unaware of the potential harm. Now, a directly harmful action, the typical character is going to be aware that that is directly harmful in all instances. You don't really need to worry about that, but it's the indirect circumstances where this second test really comes in, and this is where it is up to GM discretion of whether or not the person is aware that the action that they're going to take would potentially cause harm. So earlier I mentioned the idea that opening a cage and unleashing a tiger would be considered a hostile action because, well, it could cause harm even if that harm is indirect. Now let's imagine a scenario where I am opening a door and I don't realize that there is a tiger behind that door. Opening that door could indirectly cause harm, but because I am unaware of the presence of the tiger, that means that it's not considered a hostile action because I don't know that my actions could perceivably hurt another creature. So anytime you need to deal with this question of is an action hostile or not, you use this two-phase test. First, ask if the action will directly or indirectly cause harm to another creature, and then, second, if necessary, determine whether or not the creature is aware or unaware of the likely consequences of their actions. In most cases, this should be pretty easy to interpret, but if it is ever vague, it is up to the Game Master ultimately to decide whether an action counts as hostile or not. The next miscellaneous topic that's discussed is the idea of setting triggers. Many spells will call for your character to set a trigger that causes the effect of the spell to go off, such as an alarm spell triggering whenever someone enters an area. The discussion of setting triggers can be a very, very broad discussion, but there is one phrase that's in the setting triggers discussion that I think really solidifies the main thing you need to be aware of. In that section, Paizo writes that any time that you are setting a trigger, you're putting a simple sensory cue in place that would cause that trigger to go off. In other words, you are setting a condition that can be described in terms of physical senses that would cause your spell to, well, be triggered. Most often, this simple sensory cue is going to be sight or sound, something somebody could see or something somebody could hear, though perceivably it could fall under other senses like touch or smell as well. This is a TTRPG, weird stuff is going to happen. Ultimately, when you are setting a trigger, you want to make sure that whatever that trigger is, that it corresponds to a direct and measurable sensory cue that someone would immediately notice. As an extension of this does mean that if a spell has a trigger, that the spell trigger can be tricked. So, for example, if I set up an alarm spell that is designed to keep people from sneaking into my camp, it is possible that a cunning and crafty individual who is aware of that alarm spell could find some way of trying to get around that spell trigger. In particular, this section notes that disguises, illusion magic, and the simple stealth skill could all potentially allow a creature to avoid a spell trigger in the right circumstances. Now again, this is one of those conversations that could go a lot of different directions. So if you're dealing with this, you want to keep a few things in mind. Number one, in order for a creature to try to beat a spell trigger, they need to be aware that the spell trigger is in place. So a creature that is unaware of a spell trigger, they're not going to get that chance. If they are aware, there are ways they can try to beat that, and in those situations, the Game Master is going to decide what roles are necessary and how those rules will be resolved. Quick tip to Game Masters in this situation, the spell DC exists for a reason. But those are the things to be aware of if you're dealing with the subject of setting a spell trigger. The final miscellaneous item that's included on these pages is a discussion of a unique type of spell area called a wall. There are some spells that allow you to create walls of stone, walls of ice, walls of fire, and just kind of send them wherever you want around the battlefield. The spell description will tell you what you need to know about where and how you can place a wall. The main thing to remember is this: when placing a wall, you cannot cross a previous square that you've already placed a wall in. So if the wall is going this way, you can't loop back around and cross the wall that you previously placed. However, it is completely legitimate for a wall placement to double back or to come up against a previous placement. So you could have a wall that runs this way and then folds over and runs back just adjacent to the previous placement of the wall, effectively making the wall twice as thick. That would be a completely reasonable placement of the spell. Again, if you're dealing with a wall spell, the particulars will be in the spell description, so you'll want to read up on that, and if there's anything that's vague or hard to figure out, Game Master discretion can resolve those issues. But with that, we have come to the end of my Spellcasting 101 video for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. That is the vast majority of content covering the mechanical rules of playing a spellcaster in Pathfinder 2e. And if you have an understanding of the content in this video, the vast majority of stuff that you encounter when rolling up a spellcaster or playing a spellcaster is going to make sense to you. However, there are other topics that I will be returning to in a future video, that will allow me to go over some more nuanced situations a little more in depth. So, for example, in future videos in this series, I'm going to look at spell traits a little more in depth. I'm going to talk about things like sanctification and what that means for spellcasters a little more directly. And I will also talk about the spell shape rules, which I think are a fantastic addition to the game. I really like how Paizo manages those, so we will definitely cover those in a future video as well. As for some of the more complex topics you can expect in future videos in this series, I am obviously going to be diving into counteracting at some point because that is a standalone topic that is worth addressing. And I'm also going to look at some of these spellcasting variants that you can find in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. We'll talk a little bit about channeling elements and impulses, essentially the unique magical tricks that the kineticists used. We'll look at some of the spellcasting variants that can be found in Secrets of Magic and how those play out in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. And I also plan to come back and talk about rituals and ritual magic, which allows any character to potentially participate in a magical event, even if they are not necessarily directly a spellcaster. Still, all of those things are topics for another day, so the time has come for me to turn the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts about spellcasting in Pathfinder 2e, and do you have any questions about the topics covered in this video, or do you have any questions that you want to see me address in future videos in this series? Be sure to jump down to the comments section and let me know. And if you have any favorite tricks or tactics for spellcasting in Pathfinder 2e, be sure to leave those in the comments section as well, because there are definitely a ton of fun things you can pull off as a spellcaster. So if you have a favorite, leave those down there so that others can discover some of your favorite options. Don't forget to do all the other stuff that helps to support this channel. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. You can check out my free Discord and my Patreon. All of those links will be in the video description. But, as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.